for posterity.
And so how do we then make this smaller?
Yep, excellent. So welcome to the Better Futures Now. So this is Research Week for Western Sydney University for 2024, where we are showcasing the amazing research which is being done at the university. And this particular session focuses on leisure, health and wellbeing. So I'm Gabrielle Weidmann, and I am the research theme champion, and I'm going to lean into the champion for the health and wellbeing theme. And so that is much broader than just health, but is really about how people function optimally. And I think this session on leisure is a fantastic kind of opportunity to talk about kind of wellbeing and optimal functioning. Should I put on the slide? The introductory slide. So this event was put together by Arianne Reis and myself when we discovered the amazing work which has been done at Western Sydney around the theme of leisure. And so leisure is something that we often don't think about in terms of research and being an important and impactful thing. And I think David Rowe might touch a little bit on the kind of bad name that leisure has. But when you think about leisure, leisure is what you do when you have the choice and resources to do whatever you want to do. And so for that very reason, I think leisure is super important. We don't do it for external reward or for other reasons. We do it for the intrinsic joy of doing the thing itself. And that's what makes it so important. When you're thinking about interventions for depression, behavioural activation is one of the most cost-effective forms of intervention for depression. And behavioural activation involves scheduling pleasant events, leisure events, essentially, things that bring you joy. And so I think in terms of wellbeing, leisure is super important. There's also lots of evidence about the efficacy of exercise for mental health and wellbeing as well. And so the activities that we choose to engage in are very varied. So for some people, myself included, it's knitting, but it can be running or team sports, creative practice of some kind, socializing with friends, cultural events, traveling overseas, experiencing new things. And these are some of the things that we're going to touch on. Time in nature as well is one of those things that we choose to do when we have the time to do it. So today we're going to hear from a range of speakers about their research that they're doing around different, quite diverse areas in leisure and how leisure can add to health and wellbeing. So that can be creative practice, physical activity, time in nature, travel, all of these kind of things. But before we do that, I would like to ensure that we appropriately acknowledge the country on which this activity is being performed. So I am going to welcome Uncle Harry, and Uncle Harry has a distinguished record of service in the RAF. He's worked for a long time in that role. Uncle Harry Ali is a BEM, so British Empire Medal and Australian Defence Medal recipient. He has also worked with local government, exploring issues which are relevant to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. He is he's a community elder and a descendant of the Gajula tribal group. And he's been very influential and important in advocating for opportunities in higher education for Indigenous Australian and Torres Strait Islander people. So please welcome me in welcoming Uncle Harry, who's going to do the acknowledgement of country today.
A very good afternoon to everybody, and and particularly as I stand up here and look at all those very hard-working faces that it wears me out to know that you're making the year go by too quickly. But that's the lovely thing about being here on campus with you, and certainly I would like to thank Western Sydney for inviting me for the acknowledgement of country for today's very special event, and acknowledge the university for their recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and clans across this great land of ours. May we acknowledge and pay our respect to the clans of the Darug and Eora nations, the traditional custodians of the land on where we are gathered, and on behalf of those custodians, may I extend a warm welcome to you all. I would also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge all our elders, both past and present, who over time have ensured that our culture, history, and stories have been passed on for the safekeeping to the generations that are here with us today. As we all journey through time, may we give recognition to those of you who have joined hands with us, and may we continue to move forward on the path of reconciliation and embrace the goodwill that has been passed on to us all, and continue to give respect by listening to each other and being receptive to new ideas and acting wisely, so that we continue to coming together to embrace this wonderful country of ours, where I am sure we will also be greatly enriched by the experience. Once again, I hope the weather is kind to you and it is not too cold and not too windy. And thank you once again, and may you continue to enjoy your day.
Hello, everyone. So as Gabrielle said, my name is Arianne Reis. I'm an associate professor here at Western, and I'm really excited about today's event. As you probably know, the format of the event is that we're going to have a wonderful panel of 5 speakers who will talk a little bit. We're going to try to keep them on time about their work. And when we were putting this together, our idea was to really select people coming from very different disciplinary fields to talk about their work and how it relates to leisure. So you will be hearing from those people today. And Tony will be our moderator. So Professor Tony Rossi is a Deputy Dean of the School of Health Sciences at Western Sydney University and Professor of Health and Physical Education. He came to Western from Queensland University of Technology, where he had been acting head of exercise and nutrition science and the discipline lead for health and physical education, the area in which he has taught for most of his professional life. His research is shaped by his curiosity, largely about how people relate to their world through life and work. He has published in the areas of teacher education, teacher's work, medical education, community sport, elite sport, coach education, family feeding practices, and physical activity studies, all from a qualitative perspective and underpinned by social theory. Across his academic life, Tony has graduated about 30 HDR students, most at PhD level. More recently, he started teaching again and now teaches qualitative research methods in the postgraduate health sciences program. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Tony.
Thanks to Ari for asking me to do this. It's always a great pleasure to moderate these kinds of events. Whether I can keep these 5 people under control will be another matter, but we'll see how we go. As Ari said, we've got 5 really diverse speakers to address you today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them, and I'm going to try to bridge some of this so that you've got more time to listen to them rather than me. We've got Professor David Rowe who's going to start us with, he's got a list of affiliations which is actually longer than my CV, so he's been a prodigious scholar for a very long time. He's Emeritus Professor of Cultural Research in the Institute of Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, Honorary Professor, Centre for Sport and Physical Activity, Health and Equality at the University of Bath. Research Associate, Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy, which is at the University of London. And Distinguished Senior Research Fellow for the Centre for International Sport and Communication and Diplomacy at Beijing Foreign Studies University. He's a frequent expert commentator in the media. His books on leisure-related subjects include popular culture, rock, music, sport and politics of pleasure, all things that I adore, tourism, leisure and sport, critical perspectives, sport culture and the media, sport beyond television, and making culture, which span a period of 30 years. Joseph M. Cheer is a Professor of Sustainable Tourism and the Associate Dean International in the School of Social Sciences. He's co-editor-in-chief of the leading journal Tourism Geographies and co-chair of the World Economic Forum and Global Future Council on the future of sustainable tourism. His extensive body of work comprises books, journal articles, chapters and non-traditional publications in outlets like The Conversation, the World Economic Forum, the Global Research Institute and UNESCO. Joseph is developing a quantitative social science research agenda and is particularly keen on the development of human flourishing indicators for tourism destination communities, specifically with wider societal implications. Fiona Morrison is the Director of Open Space at the New South Wales Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. With a passion for creating vibrant and sustainable open spaces, Fiona plays a crucial role in shaping open public spaces, a network within New South Wales. Her expertise lies in design and planning for public spaces that enhance community wellbeing and promote environmental sustainability. A recent highlight of her career is her involvement in the Place to Swim program, which aims to create safe and attractive and inclusive swimming spots across New South Wales, work that she's doing with some of our colleagues here at Western Sydney University. Other programs under Fiona's leadership include Parks for People, Everyone Can Play, and the Todd Open Space program. She leads a team of dedicated designers and strategists in the Department of Open Space. Fiona continues to contribute significantly to the development of public open spaces and that network across New South Wales, ensuring that they are our spaces that meet the needs of both current and future generations. Professor Tony Rossi is a senior researcher in the Centre for Educational Research here at Western Sydney University. Her transdisciplinary research explores the intersection of the outdoor, experiential education, human nature, relationships, gender and health and wellbeing. Over 4 decades, Tonia remains committed to teaching and studying the impact of nature-infused pedagogies in her work. And in 2019, Tonia's world-renowned work and scholarship was recognised by the Association of Experiential Education when she received the prestigious Distinguished Researcher of the Year. That organisation is in the United States, so that's a fantastic achievement. Similarly, in 2014, her teaching was acclaimed nationally when Tonia received the Australian Award University Teaching, which was a national teaching award. And finally, Dr. Sandra Garrido is a Senior Research Fellow at the Marks Institute for Brain Behaviour and Development at Western Sydney University. She's Senior Manager Research at the Reach Out Australia. She has a background in both psychology and music and has been the recipient of an NHMRC ARC Dementia Research Fellowship, which was in 2016, and the Western Sydney University Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Research, which was in 2017. Her work focuses on translational research involving the arts for mental health and well-being, and in particular with people with dementia and depression. She's authored over 90 academic publications, including a book which is entitled Why We Are Attracted to Sad Music, something I would like to know the answer to. My esteemed colleagues, you have 10 minutes each, and I'm going to keep you on time.
You can just go through.
So what do I press? This one there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're probably covering the lower part of the, unless you want to sit back down and come up one by one.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. We agreed that I would go first because I'll be the kind of miserable cultural sociologist here. and then everyone will be much more upbeat afterwards. But it's a particularly appropriate day for me to be the miserable cultural sociologist. So I got up at 4:30 this morning and switched on the VPN and watched the Euro final. And so I spent most of the morning crying. And if I break down again, Dr. Jess Richards has agreed to take over from me. Anyway, thank you everyone for coming today to this important Research Week event, and especially to Arianne for organising it, and of course our Indigenous hosts. Okay, trying to make our days. The idea that in the affluent West, a leisure society had arrived or was imminent emerged in the early 1960s, pre-hippie era, and flourished in the 1970s. It is the product of an evolutionary theory proposing that industrial capitalist modernity, once defined by alienating work and controlled time and space, was irreversibly transitioning to a post-industrial, post-capitalist, post-modern, however you want to cut it, world characterized by leisure and free time. A combination of technological, social, cultural, and political changes made this leisurely world imaginable and notionally possible. In Europe, during the pre-industrial Middle Ages, leisure had little substantive meaning. Labor, which was predominantly agricultural, quite literally, in nature, both for men and women, obeyed the rhythms of sun, season, and the church bell, rather than the sirens of factories and mines. Life's routines only periodically disrupted by occasional carnivalesque days of a world turned upside down, violent folk football matches, and adrenaline-fueled peasant revolts. Under early industrial capitalism and its accompanying urbanization, dangerous days of work for men and children and the consignment of women to the private sphere, designed to reproduce many short-lived humans, while themselves risking perilous multiple childbirths, and to recreate the labor power of men, free time was at a premium. But with urbanization and worker organization, leisure and recreation beyond drinking cheap gin and cockfighting became an increasingly important part of the trade between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. A leisure industry emerged at this time to service available surplus hours and to tap growing discretionary income, as exemplified by the enclosure of sport grounds, charging for admission, the professionalization of athletes, and the rise of ancillary industries such as hospitality and gambling, a form of leisure, if you call it that, much with us today. As leisure, the etymological origin of which lies in the notion of license, time and options expanded, there was increasingly elite anxiety, not least among religious authorities, that it would stimulate immorality, especially among the young. Variations of biblical and Chaucerian proverbs, such as "the devil makes work for idle hands," which was parodied in the 2003 Futurama episode on television as "the devil's hands are idle playthings," gained increasing currency. Consequently, as is still evident today, the discourse of leisure was often marked by contests over freedom and control. Liberal nation states intervened in regulating and prescribing forms of leisure in civil society, and in the 20th century, the applied academic interdisciplinary area of leisure studies emerged to give scientific weight to the latest modes of governmentality. This was an important, logical development, and one which, like industrialism, capitalism, traveled along the lines of imperialism and colonialism beyond its origins in the West to take root in various permutations across the globe. Elements of leisure practice could be found in such dispersed places that were not produced out of a work-leisure binary structure. In Australia, for example, something resembling the leisure society could be said to exist avant la lettre, as the French would say, or before the fact. for the concept among First Nations peoples prior to the imposition of industrial time, as you can see here. We could suggest this is a kind of pre-industrial version of the late industrial notion of a leisure society, conceived within First Nations culture. But unfortunately, taking leisure seriously in an intellectual and operational sense often resulted in a rather narrow, under-theorized and technocratic approach to it that insufficiently questioned the role of the state, for example, with regard to censorship, and its increasingly intensive corporate commercialization. Those engaged professionally in the sphere of leisure, including as educators, were sometimes complicit, for example, with regard to tourism, by seeking to depoliticize its social and environmental dimensions and overemphasize its economic benefits. Although leisure studies as an interdisciplinary area and policy domain had its origins in the USA and UK, Gough Whitlam's Labour government in the 1970s made a notably progressive contribution through its equality of life agenda. In his famous November 1972 election speech at Blacktown, Sydney, not so far from here, making the case for a change of government after 12 years of Conservative Liberal National Coalition rule, Whitlam boldly stated, as you can see, there is no greater social problem facing Australia than the good use of expanding leisure. In other words, a version of the leisure society thesis. And say this was in 1972 here in Western Sydney. Aspects of this stance on leisure have not aged well in the light of substantial increases in the hours worked in various sectors, as well as with the blurring of boundaries between work and leisure, consequent upon accentuated digitization in everyday lives. Nonetheless, this was an audacious position to take at the time in pledging that every person living in Australia, as it says here, should have equal access to all things which make Australia the nation it is, and so on. This sentiment, with its openness to diverse leisure experiences and acute concern with social equity, retains its relevance as signified by Western Sydney University's health and well-being research-themed programs, espousal of, I quote, the benefits of engagement in sport, arts, music, creative practice, culture, festivals, play, tourism, recreation, and physical activity for health and well-being. As sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has proposed, though, such work requires a close focus on the distinct and intersecting cultural fields within which multiple selves are formed and shaped, social meanings proposed and contested, and practices routinized and rejected in contemporary societies. But such principles and their attendant policies inevitably confront blockages and contradictions, given the persistently economistic emphases on the predominance of the generation and distribution of private wealth. Material conditions are, of course, vitally important underpinnings of the capacity to enjoy leisure, health, and well-being. But for obvious reasons, they can overwhelm, especially during recurrent crises caused by everything from finance capitalism to pandemics to military confrontations, the domains of leisure and pleasure, vulnerable to be dismissed as optional or even indulgent. For this reason, leisure studies has been constrained in countenancing wider values and policies underpinned by cogent theories, empirical evidence, and social ethics. In a defensive play, leisure studies has frequently been forced to overpromise on the advantages of prescribed forms of leisure, which, as noted, can contain insidious elements of control and disciplinarity. Successive moral panics, a much misunderstood and misapplied concept that has infiltrated public discourse from the sociology of deviance of the 1960s, have been associated with everything from mixed-sex dancing in the 1920s and punk hairstyles in the 1970s to home videos in the 1980s and pocket smartphones in the 21st century. As the arts and culture world has discovered to its cost, one way of fending off such social anxieties around leisure has been to emphasize a primary economic imperative beneath anodyne expressions of cultural liberation. For this reason, culture has for the last 2 decades been frequently discussed in terms of the creative industries, and public diplomacy through art, culture, and sport harnessed to the export of services such as event marketing and management. A renewed program of engagement with leisure must beware of such overly instrumentalist commerce by proxy traps and, as Bourdieu has influentially argued, take account of the struggles over social and cultural as well as economic capital, to which we could add physical and embodied capital in response to the leisure, health, well-being triad. To conclude, my chair will be pleased to hear, leisure, futures and ghosts. The cautionary tone adopted here is necessary, not to discourage engagement with leisure, health and well-being, but to avoid as far as possible earlier mistakes where laudable ambitions have materialized in manipulative and even exploitative forms. The question then is not whether to engage with leisure, health and welfare. A compelling case can and has been made for it, but how? It requires a clear-eyed approach, sedulously committed to key principles of inclusion and equity, abjuring sanctimony, and to return to the often forgotten elements of folk devils and moral panics, both moral entrepreneurialism and particularly salient in our time, authoritarian populism, something we've been observing notably in the United States in recent times, as well as Europe. It's encouraging to see new generations of researchers, scholars, and practitioners enter this complex field and to witness its consistent, expansive interdisciplinarity. We can indeed help shape better futures now in leisure, health, and well-being, but only by recognizing its worst pasts, wishful thinking, and unfulfilled promises. Thank you.
Right on time. We're going to flow straight through. The questions will be at the end. So, Joseph, please.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Tony. Thank you to Uncle Harry, who wasn't here. Acknowledgements, as always, to the traditional owners of where we meet. Thank you to Arianne for inviting me to do this, and Gabrielle somewhere. And I heard Jess Richards is here somewhere. I've communicated by email, but I haven't ever met you before, so hi, Jess. I guess I have to do my slides. Give me 1 second.
Keep on going.
I'll keep, oh, they're in a queue. Okay. All right. My apologies. I also have an audio slide. I'm not sure if this is connected to audio, but that's fine if it's not. Okay. So that's me. I will flick past that quickly. It's interesting that this is connected to this entire event on leisure and well-being. And we've always argued, my colleague Willem is here from the tourism program at Western Sydney University. We're always hard at it, trying to convince people that tourism is an academic endeavor worthy of study, that it's far more sophisticated than simply travel agents and flight attendants, and that it has a very wide impact on all of our lives, because I challenge anyone to tell me that they don't go on holidays or they hate traveling. So in that respect, I'm very fortunate that this is part of the discussion. But very often when we talk about tourism or the holiday business, we talk about it from an economic perspective, as David alluded to just briefly. But what we try to do, and in particular in my work now, I'm trying to look at this from a take away the non-economic, take away the economic veneer of what we see as tourism and holidays, and look at its well-being impacts. The mother tree is always a good example when we're talking about human flourishing, you know, reaching up and reaching down as a way of flourishing. And for us, as humans, the same thing takes place. But just some brief remarks at the very beginning. This will probably blow my 10 minutes, but I'm sure Tony will remind me. You know, when we look historically at travel, the Grand Tours often comes up as an example of how you know, that gives us well-being in more ways than one. The holiday business is serious business. I was in China last week, and I'm working on a project with some Chinese scholars who were educated in the US, and they talk about serious leisure. And we're looking at eating as serious leisure, because as we know, when we travel, often food and gastronomy is a big part of what we do. Holidays are a necessary component of work contracts. David referred to that earlier. And I remember as an undergraduate student, my sociology lecturer telling me, when you're in your 50s, you'll have lots of holidays. You won't need to work so hard. Of course, you know, that's not true. We know that now. Holidays for better mental health, we know that. One of the things that emphasizes the importance of tourism and travel is that we're at a stage now where, generally speaking, we're more prosperous than we've ever been, and we have unfettered mobility. Where in the world can't we go these days? We can really, there's nowhere that's out of reach apart from, even space travel. I was going to say the moon, but we can if we have enough money for that. And there is some research when it comes to human flourishing regarding how when we go on holidays, the serotonin levels in our brain kind of build up, which leads us to having post-holiday blues when we come back, right? I mean, we've all had post-holiday blues. And in fact, many of the people who aren't here today are probably on holidays. They're the smart ones. And time in nature, which is what I will refer to as well, because very often holidays refer to time in nature, and the impact that phytoncides, or the chemicals that trees and plants release, that allows us to enhance our well-being. And I was very much interested in David's point about moral panics, because when it comes to tourism in the present day, moral panics is something we saw in Barcelona, tourists being shot with pistols, water pistols, not pistols. We also see now in Byron Bay recently how naturism is increasingly, as we lurch towards a more conservative political environment, naturism is starting to be pulled back as a way of life for us. So, okay, let me get on with things. So for us, and for me in particular, I want to do this in two parts. Talk about the study of tourism, and then secondly about how human flourishing as a kind of a touchstone comes up in the work that I've been doing recently. So, you know, I argue that the tourism is omnipresent in our lives. You know, we all take holidays, we all travel for various reasons. We're in a globalized world where not traveling is a lot rarer than traveling itself. But of course, we're also in a situation where the carbon emissions related to this needs to be considered. It's complex and it's multidisciplinary. And by way of trying to emphasize the multidisciplinary nature of what we do, I just want to talk briefly on some of the work that I've been doing when we talk about host communities and pilgrimage from on the other side, you know, Santiago de Compostela, Kumano Kodo, the Kokoda Track. You know, these kinds of activities, which are leisure and tourism, give us a whole range of beneficial impacts. Islands, you know, most of us, when we, what we envisage when we think of holidays, islands tend to come up there, and there's a very good reason why. Religious tourism as another well-being measure, and this idea of linking tourism and travel to resilience, particularly in light of the pandemic. But very often when we talk about these issues, we are focusing on the tourists. And I always say, what about the people who make these experiences possible, the communities that make these things possible, the cultural custodians that make these things possible? And so some of the work we've done on over-tourism, which is quite relevant today, comes up. Much of the emphasis on people and places has always been about the people experiencing the place, the people who are oiling the economic wheels. But what about the people in place, in places like Barcelona, in Bali? Bali is an example. When I do talks like this, Australians identify with Bali. You know, Bali is cheap. But when we talk about places that are cheap, there are implications for that. Cheapness and how we view a people and place comes into that. So as travelers, we emphasize our well-being, but what about the people who enable that well-being? And so on human flourishing in tourism, and we talk about these kinds of things in much of the work that goes on, you know, this idea of prescribing nature rather than antidepressants as a way of dealing with this. I will talk about the concept of forest bathing, which has come up and something that I did quite a bit in my 5 years living in Japan and researching the topic. And so this link to nature in highly urbanized societies has become neglected. How do we kind of encourage and steer towards these kinds of experiences rather than being stuck to our screens? This all started with a Hawaiian student of mine. We worked on this idea of yoga tourism, right? And it's linked to well-being. Now, if you go to a place like Rishikesh in India or Bali, this idea of linking a holiday with activities that promote well-being is becoming increasingly part of this whole wellness industry. And this is the challenge when these kinds of things, when human flourishing and well-being become industrialized, how do we reconcile the competing positions that inevitably come up? Colleagues Melanie K. Smith and Anya Dijkman talk about tourism and well-being. And once again, a lot of this is driven by well-being as an industry rather than as a leisure activity tied to well-being, and not necessarily the economics of well-being. And so when I first started researching the topic, living in Japan and going to Okinawa, most of you would know that in Okinawa, they have the highest number of octogenarians. It's people over 80 around the world, right? And with Japanese colleagues, we're trying to figure out, why is this so? Is it lifestyle related? Is it genetic? Or is it much more than that? And one of the things that keeps coming up is this focus on activities and things that allow us to flourish. Here, this is a type of art, ukiyo-e, which is floating pictures. And to a large degree, this is about human flourishing, about people, experiences, and activities. In Japanese communities, the bath is a central place for communication, where gossip is heard, where people see each other. I was thinking, someone asked me once, is there an example in Australia? And I would say that it's the pub, where we go to meet other people, right? But in many Japanese rural towns, it's the bath. And what is interesting about this is that while in Japanese societies, there's a conservatism in terms of how we present ourselves. In a bath, everybody's naked, right? Anything goes. Whereas imagine a bunch of and I always invited Australian scholars to come and visit me in Japan. And the first thing I did was I took them to a bath. They said, "What, we have to be naked?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yes, I've seen all my colleagues in the office naked." So as a way of, and flourishing also is about dismantling the structures that stop us from being ourselves. And so these are the kinds of areas, and this is hot spring culture. And it's very much related to flourishing. This is in the south in Shirahama, where you sit in that hot spring overlooking the Pacific Ocean, right? And so we're trying to ask ourselves, how does making this as part of one's daily routine contribute to their human flourishing? This is in a mountain village along a river, hot springs. The water's hot that flows through the river as it comes up from thermal hot springs. And this has audio, and I just want you to, when we talk about flourishing and the activities we do when we travel and the places we go, let me see if this is 2 minutes. So imagine that as a kind of as something that we could do more every day. So when it comes to human flourishing, this is something we published a few years ago. And as we say in that, the various ways in which humans can, over the course of their lives, develop and live well, and insofar as such flourishing is not to be construed atomistically, but for the most part, socially. It's social. Flourishing, to a large degree, is socially constructed. It is likely to be achieved only if certain social norms are taken on board and observed. Forest bathing, as an example, it's no wonder the Blue Mountains is very popular for weekenders, right? But again, we're doing a project in the Blue Mountains, Willem and I, with a community group who are saying that there are too many tourists in town. What about us? What about our well-being? Some of you from the Blue Mountains might feel that way. And this is a book recently on human flourishing, or Shinrin Yoku, that talks about this. Forest bathing is a cure-all. Phytoncides that we absorb. Time spent with trees can boost the immune system, increase energy, decrease anxiety, depression, and anger, reduce stress, and bring about a state of relaxation. It's a wonder we don't do this more often. Further on, forest bathing. Forest has high oxygen levels compared to urban or indoor environments. as you breathe in the fresh air. And we know this, right, to a large degree. Sleep tourism is another link between tourism, leisure, and well-being. Anyone with little children, I'm sure you identify with this. Similarly with holidays, right? Holidays are not so relaxing if you've got two under 5-year-olds sitting in the back screaming their heads off, right? But this again emphasizes the way tourism and well-being are more closely linked in many ways. And well-being as an industry, as I said, there's medical tourism at one end of the spectrum and wellness tourism on the other side. So this motivation and desire for healthy living is something that has come up as we've become more prosperous and affluent, and can afford, have discretionary income to spend on these kinds of things. The global wellness tourism industry is huge, right? In the US, it's 840. They say it's 814 billion. The Wellness Institute talks about this being a $5.6 trillion industry linked to all of those other things. So toward inclusive human flourishing tourism, where to for host communities? These are some of the things in Japan recently. A weekend and a very Instagrammable culture has meant that people are descending on the country, but it's creating something that Japanese have coined in their language. It's tourism pollution, and so well-being for one, but the decline of well-being for the other. We saw this recently. Tourism kills the city, tourism terrorists, and those kinds of things, and so. When we talk about well-being in regards to this, this is well-being in a way, lying on the beach, but well-being for who is what we often ask, and how do we value this well-being in both monetary and non-monetary senses? So in conclusion, it might be that human flourishing is the key that unlocks nuanced insights into the sector's deeper and enduring impacts on us as individuals. Given the new normal, this was written just after COVID, and COVID has in many ways accelerated our focus on well-being and travel. The flip side is the carbon emissions that we burn up when we travel. That's it. Pressure's on.
Oh no. You're gonna have to give me a wave, I get there.
My little stick.
I know. I'm even going to time myself because my head is actually quite all over the place now listening to both David and Joseph. I stand here as someone representing the New South Wales government in open space, and that's what my team does. We work in the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure, which names changes far too often. I'm going to specifically talk about places to swim, but I'm going to try and connect in some of the thoughts that were being made previously by David and Joseph, because Places to Swim is a really important program, and it's a really important piece of work that was done. I stand here for Nikki Morrison, actually, who's one of your esteemed colleagues who we engaged the university to do some research for us on Places to Swim, and in a wonderful document. I've got a few copies over on the side that you're welcome to take. And this is a perspective around why it's really important. We have lots and lots of beaches in Australia, but not everyone lives near a beach. And one of those wonderful photos previously about a different beach in a different country is what some of our beaches look like in summertime. And as a ginger, not everybody wants to go to the beach. So I like to have things without sand and grass and trees. So Places to Swim was a program that was established a few years ago, and it was about creating equal access. Think of the people who are living in Western Sydney, who have to drive an hour and a half and then fight for parking. How do we create places that people can swim anytime that they like? Tying into leisure, I mean, swimming is a really big part of any Australian lifestyle. When you think of your earliest memories as a child living in Australia, or if you've come here as a new resident to the country, I mean, everybody goes to Bondi Beach. It's one of the first things people do when they get off a plane. They go to the beach, which causes all sorts of problems. Our water here is very different to water elsewhere, but it is a big part of the vernacular of the Australian society and a big part of the identity of Australians. We're about to head into the Paris Olympics. We all care about the swimmers, don't we? How many gold are the swimmers going to win? Yeah, there's runners and there's equestrian, there's all sorts of things, but well, geez, we care about those swimmers. So swimming is a very, very big part of our identity. And it's been a part of the way our open space network has been forever and a day. We did some research back in 2018 and we asked Sydney-siders what they would like out of their open space. You know, our task is to create an open space network that meets the needs of people today and into the future. So the first thing we did when we started with the department, just on 7 years ago, was to find out what people wanted. The number one thing Sydney-siders wanted was access to water. And that's to get in it, to get on it, to get around it, to look at it. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. There's a recreation and a leisure reason, but there's also an aesthetic and a beauty reason, and there's a cooling reason. So the access to water isn't just about getting in for a swim. Think about if you have a choice to walk down the street or you have a choice to walk around a lake, which one are you doing? Which one does the dog want to do, more importantly? And I promise you the dog wants to go in the water. So we were fortunate enough to get some funding that would encourage communities, encourage councils to look at places to swim. These are really hard things to create in a society that is incredibly risk adverse. The coastal councils do it quite well, but any of the councils inland, any of our regional councils, they do struggle with the idea of having places to swim because it does conjure up a lot of risk. So not only that, to the program that we had, and we funded sites all over the place, we created a guideline. There's copies over there as well. I come bearing gifts. And this is a guideline about how do you do it? How can you unlock the potential of waterways that could be dams, creeks, rivers, lakes, all over regional and Western Sydney to create places to swim. The value and the importance of swim is quite profound. There is a spiritual element to it. There is a tourism element to it. So much of what Joseph has said about tourism, you know, the public open space network is almost the foundation of where all of that happens. When you think about, you know, with David, art, culture, sport, and entertainment, if you want to do that freely, you go into a park. Concerts in parks, whether it's carols by candlelight or outdoor movies or whatever it is, they are places in public open space that we are looking to foster and encourage people to do more of. In my bio, one of the projects that probably doesn't mean anything to anyone, because in government we like to talk in acronyms, is TOD, which is Transport Orientated Development. If you haven't heard about it in the media, it's where we're focusing on housing in areas where there's train stations, basically. My team has the challenge of putting parks into those precincts, but they are so essential because it's the new front door, front yard and backyard to everybody who's living vertically. So we need to create open space that has a connection for people, but we also need to create places that are inclusive of everybody. And that's a foundation of all of the work that we're doing. So to inform that, we don't rely on ourselves. We get a group of smart people in a room. They sit there, they tell us what needs to happen, what doesn't need to happen. They shape the guidelines. And again, risk, connection to country came out very, very strongly as well. And it's these aspects that we've used to help demonstrate great places to swim across New South Wales. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about Penrith Beach. I'm not going to call it Bondi. We find that derogatory. But Bondi, is everybody familiar with Penrith Beach? Okay, so Penrith Beach came to us. A colleague and I got a tour of Penrith Lakes. And somebody foolishly showed us Lake B, which is what this is called, Lake B, where the sand was there. And my colleague and I went down, stood on the water, and we were like, this is amazing. And it was winter. It was a day like today that nobody wants to think about swimming. Anyway, as it happens, as things happen in government, the wheels turn. And then one day I got a call, Fiona, you're putting a beach in Penrith. And I'm like, what? I'm not doing one of those like wave machine things. I want to do something proper. And they're like, no, we're going to do a beach in Penrith. And Penrith Beach is our first activation. And last year was its first year. We had more than 250,000 people come to the beach. It was a moderately hot summer. We had a few days when we were flooded out, if you can believe it. But what it demonstrated was this overwhelming response to being near water, especially in Western Sydney. There's about 20 other projects that we've funded across Sydney that are looking to create opportunities to swim. But the big things we learned was about free access and inclusion. We learned about water quality and the need to overcome perceptions about water quality. And also we need to do more about water safety and learning to swim. We have a very incredibly culturally diverse community in Western Sydney that don't have access to swim. Lake water is very, very different to surf water. Because it's not salt water, as I worked out eventually being out in the middle of it, you're not buoyant. So there's a lot more work you have to do, which is why you need to take a noodle or some kind of flotation device if you're going out there this year coming. But we need to make sure people are safe going into the water. One of the challenges that we had was the desire for people to go. They wanted to I'm going to call it Penrith Beach bathe. They wanted that flourishing. They wanted that environment to be able to sit and just relax. And the most beautiful aspect of this, it's one of the only places on the eastern side of the country where you get sunset over the water. And it is truly spectacular. Some of the other projects that we have funded, and I'm nervous at sharing this one because I kind of don't want anyone to know it exists. And if you haven't been there, it's in construction at the moment. Don't go just yet. Yerongabilly Caves precinct in Kosciuszko National Park, absolutely incredible. It's a thermal pool, and we're funding it so that you can have inclusive access down into the water so people of all abilities can get there. But the most important thing about what we've done, and particularly the work that Nikki and her team did, was to identify that water is an important part of our life. You know, we are mostly made of water. We want to get in it, on it, and around it as many times as possible so that we can flourish in our public open space. And that was 10 minutes and 70.75.
Tonia is up.
Pressure on, I've got my clock ready. We'll see how we go timing wise. Okey-doke. That's just gone, so anyway, we'll wing it. Okay, I'm Tonia Gray from Education, and I'd like to start by, mine's slightly different. Because we're in education, we look at children, and in particular, screen time. What are they doing in their leisure time? My history, I'm a PE health teacher, and in fact, Nikki is sitting in the room somewhere. Maybe wave your hand. Nikki did one of these. We walked from Katoomba to Mittagong. I've actually done it 13 times, and actually your partner's done it as well, Nick. We were teaching recreation or outdoor education at Wollongong. I tried to bring it to Western Sydney, but as Fiona just talked about, risk adverse, not only in sport and recreation, institutions are a little bit risk adverse. I want to just plant that seed there. Next, as an educator, experience, process, reflect and apply. That's how we learn. And our beautiful failures are part of the learning cycle. But when we look at modern society, how many beautiful failures do children have available to them? We know that we've got to step out of our comfort zone and move into that fear zone, which is where you challenge yourself, because that's where the best learning and the best growth occurs. All agree? And we'll now wed that with biophilia, which is a little bit about what Joseph was talking about, green and blue. People want that. It's a prescription. Doctors are actually prescribing it now because we go to the beach or we listen to waterfalls or bird song or whatever when we're super stressed. Now, E.O. Wilson coined this term in 1984, so there's nothing really new other than I think Indigenous populations have known it for decades, and we're just waking up. So there's a therapeutic role. But now this is the most important thing. The word kindergarten comes from kids in the garden. And I now look over towards Arthur Phillip High School in their 17-storey building, and how many children are in gardens or outdoors learning. I just plant that idea there as a hypothetical as well. We know that children need it for their growth and development, and that's how curiosity, experimentation, and wonders of the world are found out. So risky play, it's not new, but my goodness, it's newly important because in my childhood, I was given unbridled freedom. Now, I just got off an ABC radio interview as I drove up here. The tracking devices that they're putting on children, parents, because they're worried that their child's going to get kidnapped, they've never been more safer. I just wish parents would let the pendulum swing from being hyper-vigilant to, come on, a bit of benign parenting here, and you would be doing your child a great value. Then we look at our generations. I'm just going to focus now down on Gen Z and Gen Alpha. My daughter is Gen Y, and I can tell you actually, I can pinpoint when computers came into schools. She was born in 1990. Early in that time, by the time she hit school at 1995, you saw the impact that computers were having on them. I'm not demonizing computers, don't get me wrong, but there has to be a balance, and we will come to that in a moment. But Gen Z and Gen Alpha are the most overwhelmed generation we've ever seen in history. They do not have the ability to self-regulate, to confront hardship and adversity, and I would say that this is then linked right back to their childhood. So my childhood, as I said, being online was swinging on the clothesline around. Modern children, their online environment absolutely not only captivates them, it mesmerizes them to a point where they're addicted. I walk into even just walking here from a train station or whatever, everyone is there. It's like it's Soma, and it's the new drug, if you read A Brave New World, that we are just so addicted to this for our well-being, or so we think. But Richard Louv coined the term, we need more vitamin N, and that means vitamin nature. So unplug, deboot, and get back into the real world, and that's what children need. So I'll just skip this one very quickly because Ari's worried that I'm going to move not fast enough. There is this bubble wrap children that we don't even let them play on play equipment if we think it's too risky. We don't let them climb trees. 1 in 4 Australian children, I'll repeat that, 1 in 4 has never climbed a tree. Let that one sink in. Superimpose that with, they spend 52 hours on screen and 40 minutes outside. 52 hours on screen, 40 minutes outside. You can see we've got a recipe for a disaster, but the importance of risky play in nature has never been more important than now, because risk plays a pivotal role in experiential education, just as oxygen does to sustaining the body. And now in particular, there's never been a bigger need to get kids back out in the wild and muddy boots and getting their clothes dirty, which a lot of parents don't even like as well, but that's another story and I'm not going there right today. But the parents are the upstream determinants of what a child will be allowed to do. And with that in mind, I'm going to tell you a story and where all of our risk research is heading. Oops. This is obviously putting your abseiling on and going through high ropes courses or low ropes courses or whatever. The vestibular system of a child is developed when you are moving and using your balance. If you're not having those sorts of experiences, of course, you're sitting solo and sedentary in front of a computer or a screen, how are we going to develop the child's full growth and potential? Risk intelligence, most importantly, up until the age of 25, your prefrontal cortex will be developed, and that is where your risk regulation is. If you haven't been exposed to it, this is where we've got so much antisocial behaviour. So many young kids are getting in cars, stealing them, going for a joyride and then wrapping themselves around a tree, as happened in my area last night. As terribly sad as it is, are they crying out for this sensation seeking because they haven't had enough of it in their childhood? That's just a hypothetical question. I'll leave that there. But my hometown built this wonderful playground of $22 million at Berry, and it was called the Nature Play Park. But here's where the story goes bad. In the first month of it opening, after much fanfare of politicians, etc., this one slide caused broken legs and whatever. Where it went wrong was, it wasn't the kids' fault, it was the parents' fault, because the kids had said, no, I don't want to go down it. The parents then tandemed down with them, like doubled them down. And as the kids' legs were coming through the final tunnel, they got bent back and broken. And the rest is history. And then the spate of, we're moving on. There we go. We can see it there. It became headlines, and then it got worse and worse and worse, because we were then Australia's most dangerous playground, because there was broken tooth, broken arms, broken legs, and so on. But in essence, children will intuit their limits. That's what I want to say. And that child that said, no, I don't want to go down the slide, was actually intuiting her own limits. The parent should step back. This is where I really am starting to see the problem emerging from helicopter parents, to protect or not. We've made playgrounds so monumentally boring that any self-respecting child is going to go somewhere else, somewhere usually more interesting and usually much more danger. But there is a difference between danger and risk. Let me point that out, okay? And we've sanitized childhood to such a limit that, we are, as teachers or parents or whatever, even urban playgrounds, if you're looking at your planning, you are doing a disservice to children. Risk literacy has been lost. They no longer know that 2 hands and 1 foot, so 3 points of contact, will keep them safe while they're climbing. You'll see them start to swing on one hand, and the parents don't even know what to say to them, because they themselves are a little bit risk illiterate. Is this making sense? So it's wonderful about Berry. It's got lots of this, and the parents come down with their cappuccinos and whatever. But the most important thing is a child must become a risk technician. If they're going to go through life unscathed, you need as many risky experiences as possible. Because when you get behind the wheel of someone who may be intoxicated and you don't want to be there as a passenger, if you can't say, I don't feel safe, I'm out of here, then there's something wrong. So when you're being exposed to risk, you have those skills, you self-regulate what is safe, what is not. But fear, 10% of it's real, and 90% of it is all inside your head. I'm going to finish here on one of the best things. Just come out worldwide, ISO, the international standards for organisations, they've now flipped it and made it the benefit risk assessment. So if you can now say the benefits outweigh the risk, go for it. So Western Sydney, I hope you're hearing me loudly when I come to you soon and say I want to take kids from Katoomba to Mittagong again, that the benefit will outweigh the risk. And also in Canada, we've just had the paediatricians come out and make a statement to the world that this is where it's going. Kids need risky play. I'm going to move really quickly because this is more health stuff. I haven't even touched on ADHD, loss of speech, because speech therapists are seeing, kids can't talk anymore because they're on a screen the whole time, the bullying, eco-literacy, blah, 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 blah. But let's now move As a result of that study that we did at Boongaree and published it, we then did a special issue in the Journal of Outdoor and Environmental Education. Unbeknownst to me, the world was ready for this. As soon as it hit the press, we had The Conversation wanted to write a piece, CNN picked up the piece that we wrote and put it all through America, Mamma Mia, and on and on and on. And I've never had so many interviews ever since. So there's this appetite that parents realise we've got this all out of whack, let's get some balance, etc. I'm going to finish here because it's where I've got to finish. Coming out very soon, we've got 2 books, Risk and the State of Outdoor Play for Children, and actually it's giving parents permission to embrace risk. And let's hope we have a much healthier world where Gen Z and Gen Alpha can encounter risk with confidence. Okay, thank you. I'll move it really quickly on because you never know how fast.
Well done, Tonia. Thank you very much. And our final presenter is Sandra.
So I'm going to be talking to you about music today. It's a big part of our lives, isn't it? I'm wondering how many of you here listened to music or heard music in your environment when you were traveling to this event today. Would you like to put your hand up if that was you? Yeah, so pretty much everyone, nearly everyone. So the research tells us that some recent figures that have come out in 2023, people around the world are spending about 21 hours a week listening to music. For young people, it's even more, around about 5 hours a day on average. And if they're going through episodes of depression or anxiety, 10 hours a day of music listening. It's a really big chunk of their time. And music is around us all the time. One of the things that the research tells us about why we listen to music, one of the biggest motivations that people have for listening to music is to modulate their moods and their emotions in some way. We do it deliberately sometimes it's unconscious, but think about the fact that if you go to the gym, you might select a particular playlist because you're aiming to feel energized. If you want to sleep at night, you might choose something completely different. If you're setting up an intimate date for somebody you love, you're going to choose, the right kind of music to create the atmosphere that you're after. So we use music deliberately in this way to kind of manipulate our moods and to create atmosphere. It's a leisure activity, but it's also something that, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, we use to improve our well-being and to manage our moods and our emotions. And it's effective in doing so. It's a fairly old study from 1994. They're from Thayer, but Thayer and colleagues looked at all sorts of different things that people do in their daily lives that make themselves feel better. And exercise was the biggest thing that could actually have a positive effect on mood. Music was number 2. So not only is it pervasive throughout our lives, but it's a really big part of how we achieve well-being in a fairly easy and accessible way. It's around us all the time. We've got access to music quite easily. So, excuse me, the Australian Psychological Society also found that 80% of Australians said that they use music to cope when they're experiencing psychological distress. Does it always help? Well, our research has shown that people differ in their levels of awareness of the type of music or the right music to listen to in different situations and the effect that that has on their mood. So, for example, in our research, we found that sometimes people who experience mood disorders, for example, like depression, sometimes they have less access to helpful strategies for managing their moods, and that can flow into their music choices as well. Sometimes the music that they choose can be helpful. Other times it might actually be making them get a little bit stuck in some negative emotions. So there are different levels of awareness that people have. The majority of people are really good at choosing music and just do that instinctively. But sometimes, particularly young people, when their mood mood regulation strategies might not be so well developed, they can do with a little bit of guidance about how to make really good choices about the music they listen to. So a couple of areas that our research has gone in. I'll give you some examples of, Tony mentioned that I'm interested in translational research. So all of this research that we've done about the effect of music on our mood and our well-being, we've looked at how can we use that to actually help people understand how to use music more effectively in their lives. So this is a free smartphone app that we've developed called Moody Tunes. It's been co-designed with young people. So young people aged 15 to 25 sat down with us, and we started by presenting them with the research and saying, this is what the research has said about how people use music to regulate their moods, when it's helpful, when it's less helpful. And then we asked those young people to help us work out, how could we build an app? What should it do that might help young people to become more aware of that? So basically what this app does is it uses principles from cognitive behavioral therapy, also principles of experiential learning. It's not about prescribing particular music and telling people this is the music you should listen to, but it's about young people actually exploring the music that they listen to and becoming more aware of the effects that it's having on their mood and their well-being. So basically, as the user listens to music in Spotify, it then helps them to track the effect that that's having on their mood, and to build playlists that include music that makes them feel good. And through that process, they're actually coming to a better understanding of the choices that they make and how that affects their mood and their well-being. One of the things that we found in our research is that often when we're listening to music, particularly if we're going through a little bit of a rough time, we might have fallen into habits of pulling out particular music at particular times. If you're feeling a bit sad, some people kind of have a sad music playlist that they pull out all the time. And it gets to be a habit without really reflecting on, is that music actually helping me? And for some people it does, like listening to your sad music playlist can be really useful for getting emotions off your chest and processing some of the things that you're going through. But then for other people, it doesn't. And so in our research, that process of tracking the effect that music listening is having on mood has been really effective. And so we recently just completed a pilot study with 70 young people who used the Moody Tunes app. And what we found was one of the biggest effects was that we found they used it for a 4-week period. Their mental health literacy increased. So they developed a much higher, a much better understanding of the things that they could do to try and manage their moods and their emotions, and when they might need to get professional help, because the app also directs them to professional help when needed. But we also found that over that 4-week period, stress and anxiety reduced as well. So users were learning how to use music in effective ways to reduce their stress and their anxiety levels. And we know that music can really have that effect. So just a little bit of increased self-awareness that something like this can give seems to be really useful for young people that might not have worked out what works for them just yet. The other area in which we've done a lot of research is about people with dementia. And so for people with dementia, they often, especially as their condition is progressing, they often have less control in their environment over the music that they're listening to. So music might have been a really important part of their lives all through their life. And then suddenly if they end up in an aged care facility, A, there might not be any music, or B, they might be exposed to endless repetitions of ABBA DVDs in the communal living areas, which is a nightmare for people who don't like ABBA. But the whole thing about music and identity gets removed from their control. And so we've developed some resources for aged care staff to help them understand how they can create personalized music listening experiences that not only bring that sense of connection and identity for the individual back into their lives, but can also help the staff because they're using it in a targeted, strategic way to try and manage some of the challenges that the person living with dementia might be experiencing. So, for example, the research shows very clearly that listening to music is particularly good at reducing agitation in people with dementia and anxiety and depression, and also increasing their level of engagement in the environment around them. So I can think of one example of a lady that I worked with dementia, and I asked her what kind of music she liked, and she said, "Oh, anything, dear, just play whatever you like." It was obvious to me that she couldn't really remember the names of singers or any particular songs that she liked. So I played a few things to her and she said, "Oh, that was lovely, dear," at the end of every song. And then I played a piece of opera. I was just trying random things. And suddenly her face lit up and she remembered that she was a singer, something that she had actually forgotten about herself previously. And then she was able, she went from a place where she couldn't even tell me songs or singers that she liked or anything, to being able to tell me these detailed stories about taking her children to the opera and her children sitting there during rehearsals and things like that. It had been a really big part of her life, but she'd lost connection to those memories until she heard that piece of music. So the resources that we've developed, there's a PDF guide that people can download about how they can use music to support some of the challenges that people with dementia are living with throughout the day. Also, a short training module that caregivers can go through, and there's an alternative credential which is co-badged by Western Sydney University and Hammond Care and the Dementia Centre we've developed with them. So I'm pretty sure that's the end of my slides. That's a little bit about how we have been looking at music as leisure and as a big part of our lives, but then also how we can use what we know about the effect of music on wellbeing to begin to use it more strategically to really improve our wellbeing in various parts of the world.
Okay, can I invite all of our speakers to come up? I'll stand here. We want to use these ones?
One for the other minutes.
Yeah, one for the, and then one to move along here. Or, yeah. Okay, it's question and answer time now. It's funny when you do these things, say, okay, who's got a question? Then it's stony silence the next 30 seconds. So I've got some crib questions here in case you kind of fall silent, but I'm sure you've got lots to ask. We've gone from history and culture to tourism and well-being. We've gone to a risk-averse nation. We've gone to risk literacy and trying to understand literacy. We've gone to music and how that might actually be an enabler in terms of mood regulation. Since I've been listening to a lot of The Clash lately, you might kind of need to speak to me about that, I think. Okay, we've got a reasonable amount of time. The floor is open. You can ask the panel a question, or you can direct your question to one member of the panel if you would prefer that. So who's going to get us started? Wonderful.
Running around. Hello, I'm Gwenda, and I have a question for all of you. All the presentations were so diverse. Your backgrounds are so diverse, yet you have something in common about leisure. I'd really like to know what each of you have as a kind of your own perspective of leisure in a few words. Is that okay?
Okay, we'll start that in and move on.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite. Our own perspective, as in what we actually do as in leisure, or? Oh, right, concept of leisure. Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes, good question, because obviously it's a very diverse concept, and I was reading something, doing a bit of prep for this this thing where someone was trying to destroy the whole idea of, of leisure. So let's put it in the dustbin. I think, as I think I indicated certainly at the start of my talk, I don't think that leisure, certainly in modernity, in the sort of in the era in which we all live, has any meaning if you don't place it in relation to something which we call work. So there is free time, I think broadly licensed, that I was talking about, and constrained time. So that's the way that I kind of think of leisure, as broadly in that notion of free time. But I guess the point I was making at the end is that, to some degree, and certainly if you work in the knowledge industry, as most of us do, I'm not quite sure where leisure and work can be easily separated. As my family tell me, as I'm supposed to be an emeritus professor, which means I'm no longer on the payroll, but I'm here today. Is this work or is this leisure for me?
As a follow-on, I think personally, I talk more about leisure than I'm actually doing it. And I think that's a bit of a travesty, right? But I think you're right, David. You know, for me anyway, the lines between work and leisure are very much blurred. This does that, right? We can check emails at any time of the night. We can be working at any time of the night. We can finish that chapter if we can't sleep, which is what I do, which is kind of ridiculous. But in terms of leisure, I suppose one of the things that I often think about when we think about human flourishing is that leisure introduces processes of change. And I often ask the question, should leisure be pleasurable only and not stressful? I know when I travel, a lot of times it's stressful, but it's also pleasurable at the same time. So I tend to think of leisure as being a whole lot of things and not just pleasurable, I think. But I also think of leisure from an economic perspective, because that's what we have to do to some degree. You know, not everyone has the same amount of leisure time. So leisure and class and those kinds of issues are also important ones to consider.
You talk about masochism as well.
I guess from my perspective, the word leisure and often the word recreation kind of get confused or alternated with each other. In the work that we do, we're about creating space where either can happen. I've done a marathon for leisure. I can tell you it was not enjoyable at all. But you could also say that was recreation. So we have a bit of a challenge in what we do in trying to manage definition. I spend my life having arguments about definition, active recreation, passive recreation, leisure. For me, it's when you're not made to be somewhere, it's all the other stuff. And sometimes you can be made to be at a job that you really love. So you're not really made, but you're required to be there. You have a requirement of service. All the other times is leisure. My leisure is going over to the UK, my tourism, sitting in a National Trust property in a nice deck chair, reading a book, looking at somewhere beautiful. I can't help it. I'm a landscape architect.
Yeah, following on from that, so Gwenda, sorry. For me, I think back to in the 70s, and we had Norm, the leisure that sat on the chair, and we were promised we were going to have more leisure. Weren't we fooled? But leisure to me is what you're doing in those times when you are being creative, or you may be wanting to improve your physical fitness, or whether you're just having your sanctuary for your well-being. Personally, me, I live on 25 acres. I've got this most amazing view. I very much rely on green and blue space for my leisure to recharge that sanctuary, that part of me that I need. But just as many have mentioned, it's really hard to switch off in these days. And I think we need to remind ourselves that leisure is to be valued, and it's a resource which is becoming less and less available.
I'm not sure I've got much to add to what all these experts have already said. I really liked the definition that Gabrielle gave us at the beginning about it being what you choose to do when you've got the freedom to make that choice. And yeah, I mean, for some people, it might be doing something really quiet, like reading a book. For other people, it might be painting the house or running a marathon or whatever. There's so much that we choose to do. And I think that also is impacted by how much leisure time we have available to us. But yeah, just the things that we naturally are drawn to and that we enjoy doing, that we want to do whenever we've got that choice.
Awesome. It reminds me of a story. We used to go camping when I lived in Brisbane to Byron Bay pretty much for 10 years running. And my young stepson was an avid planner. You say, okay, first 5 minutes check in, second 5 minutes park car. And then we had to do the tent. And then there was this space. And we said, well, what stage? He said, oh, I've scheduled in some free time, which I always thought was funny, being on holiday. Okay, questions from the audience? Okay, Jess, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name's Jess. I work in the sport management team in the School of Business. Again, condolences, David, for this morning's results. My question is actually for Professor Chia. We've had a few email correspondence relating to a project within Australia and Japan. But my question is about sports tourism. It seems that when we think about medical tourism or wellness tourism, the focus is very much on the individual and their growth and their journey. I just wondered if there were benefits of traveling in a group and assuming that group identity, particularly if you're going to support your favorite sport team or Taylor Swift or whatever it is you're traveling for in that capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. That's a very tricky question. The first thing that came to mind was going to the MCG and watching Collingwood. Those kinds of ideas of bonding and being part of something bigger than yourself are naturally there. But I think when it comes to sports tourism, I mean, there's a continuum of different types of sports tourism. At the moment, we are on the verge of Paris 2020, was it now? 24. And there are some colleagues who are in Paris at the moment, and they said, there are no tourists around. Paris is quiet. It seems like this idea of sports bringing everybody together has now got to the point where it's actually fragmenting and people are actually trying to get away from it as much as they can. We think about why cities around the world are not choosing to host these mega events like the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games. I think the Commonwealth Games has been shopped around different cities in more recent times. Will that mean the end of it? Will these kinds of mega sports events revert to being televised events that people watch only? I don't really have a clear answer to your question, Jess, but I would say that sports tourism has always been seen as a very critical part of the way many cities, I guess, appear on the world stage. And I was talking about Barcelona in my talk earlier and how it's become this tourist mecca. The Olympics way back when was it? 1922. Yeah, was really the result. What we see today is a result of that, that lit the flame, if you will. And so will sports tourism remain a big part of cities and they're coming out? I think more and more, I don't think so. So what does that mean? Hopefully it means that we revert more to local sport. There's a local turn where we watch sport in our own backyards rather than the football in Europe. Sorry.
Okay. Another question. Yeah, we'll go Gabrielle and at the back.
I have a question for David and Joseph about the industrialization of leisure. And is it the process of industrialization itself that takes away from the flourishing aspect by putting it in economic terms? you are essentially taking away the intrinsic value of the thing per se. And what is the antidote to that? How do you keep it not industrialized?
Thank you. Yes, a very good question. And you know, I mean, I'm aware that a number of people make a living in the worlds that I'm describing, and so quite rightly would object to me criticizing it. I suppose there is an element, yes, I would agree, of romanticization in the position that I take. But I think I've seen too many examples where it's an old term, the logic of capitalism or the logic of industrialism. Very old concept. Sorry, it's my revealing my residual Marxism here, as I probably did throughout my talk. But that it can, I think it can distort and malform and forms of leisure which then become oppressive in various ways. People have been making fun about me in the football today. But for example, I'm a great critic of the English Premier League. I support another team lower down, Plymouth Argyle, lower down the leagues. Though it's quite close now, the Premier League's been successful lately. But for me, say that the English Premier League has taken the idea of professional football, and there's nothing wrong with being paid to be a footballer, to something way beyond that, which is taking it well beyond. We were talking about where people live, their identity of where they live, and all the money is concentrated in the 20 clubs in the Premier League, which gets 7 or 8 times the amount of capital that goes to the 44 teams or whatever it is below them, more 64 teams or whatever it is, and then that's not enough to have an English Premier League, and then you have to have a European Super League. You need it and something else to get bigger. So I suppose that's my objection to trying to interrupt the logic, so that in the end the kind of profit imperative doesn't overwhelm pretty much everything else.
Yeah. Well, the first thoughts that came to mind, and I apologize if anyone likes cruising, but I couldn't think of anything worse than going on a cruise. But that's not to say that there are people who don't enjoy it. I mean, in many respects, it has many benefits. You can go 3 or 4 different destinations. You don't have to get off the ship. You can take the whole family along with you and have cabins adjacent to each other, and it's safe, apart from going overboard. And I also think of Kon-Tiki tours. I don't know if anyone's been on a Kon-Tiki tour. You don't need to volunteer. But for me, the idea of travel is self-discovery. The idea of traveling with a bunch of people, to me, is kind of the antithesis of why we travel, to discover ourselves. But then I'm being very snobby and highbrow about what travel means. Many destinations are now saying, we don't want backpackers and the average traveler. We want people who can spend a lot of money and that kind of thing. So travel has become a status thing. It's inevitably becomes monetized because it requires a whole supply chain to make it work. And I think back, when we were children, we would probably jump in the car and go 2 hours up the coast for a holiday. Now we put everyone on a plane and we go to Bali or Fiji or somewhere else. So this escalation of consumption in every walk of life, I think, extends to travel as well. We want to go further, stay longer, go somewhere more exotic. And I wonder if there's a ceiling to all of this, but it's a commentary on life generally, right?
We had a question right at the back.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Luke. I'm from the city of Parramatta. I work in the over 55s leisure and learning section. I've been involved in sport most of my life, close to 20 years now. It's just a general question for the panel. Growing up in sport and being involved in sport, no matter what role I always had to kind of justify the importance of, sport and recreation. And some people would look at me and say, well, you run sport and you organize kicking a ball. And I'd always say, no, it's more than that. It's a physical, it's mental, it's spiritual, it's emotional, it's neurological. I just wanted to ask the panel, how have you seen changes in sport and recreation and its importance over the years to something being, well, you're just kicking a ball, to now that it's a vital part of life? That when I worked at Macquarie University, for example, with students, I'd say, you know, if you have money, spend it on going to the gym or, you know, physically working on yourself or mentally, because when you don't do that, other aspects of your life can be affected. So I just wanted to know, the question is, if there is a question, how have you noticed a change in sport and recreation over the years, and where do you see it going in the future?
Okay, I'll have a stab. From an open space perspective, which is, I guess, the foundational platform that sport and recreation can enjoy itself happening from. Like many things, you know, we have fought really hard for open space to be considered infrastructure, just plain out good old infrastructure, as important as education facilities, as important as hospitals, as important as roads, as important as sewer. And it's a really, really hard sell because open space is free. I tried to do this provocative exercise a couple of years ago when we were trying to get open space and infrastructure in a sentence together. Not essential, not critical, just together. And my idea was that I'd take a really, really popular park in inner west part of Sydney, and I'd close it and put a toll on it. And I'd see how quickly everybody cared about the park. Whereas at the moment, it's free, it's available, it's there 24/7. Nobody really has to pay for it. It's kind of hidden in your rates. So it is a really, really big challenge to be able to articulate. It is essential as anything. So to answer your question, have I seen the change? We now have a document that says it's critical infrastructure, essential infrastructure for communities. It's a part of the housing delivery of the government and the housing portfolio of government. So it is certainly changing. And I think that comes down to yes, there are advocates within government that are pushing that, you know, that barrow and trying to lift that ceiling. But it's also the collective knowledge of everybody in this room and the community demanding that of government and demanding that of developers and demanding that of councils, that we have to create places where people of all ages and all backgrounds can identify with their local area, but just participate and be outside. As our housing stock changes, as we go and live more vertically, as we have more density or diversity, whichever way you want to call it, we have to create the space for people to enjoy it. So that's the change I've seen. I've seen it in the change of the investment levels in terms of dollar that governments put into open space, which is, as I said, the place where a lot of the leisure activities and sport can happen.
Yeah, if I go next. Yeah, okay. Thanks. A very good question. And I mean, having done a PhD on the post-punk popular music industry in Britain, and then I somehow stumbled into sport, and I was told that sport was an area for downwardly mobile sociologists, which was, and so I encountered a lot of snobbishness towards sport. And my, as a sociologist, essentially a popular culture, my view was, look, sport is first, above all else, it's a form of culture. It's a form of physical culture. And there are many forms of culture, and I think it has its advantages and as well as disadvantages in various ways. But I mean, following the previous point, I've done quite a few consultancies over the years in the area of cultural infrastructure, and there is this, which is essentially people think of the arts, which is kind of quite a, obviously has quite an elite reputation, and sport doesn't generally. So when you're trying to talk about cultural infrastructure and get the art portfolio and the sport portfolio together, it's very hard. And I've done it, by the way, for Parramatta City Council, amongst as well as Sydney, Inner West, Penrith, Northern Sydney, a whole range of councils. So I think you're right to say that people who are hostile to sport have a very one-dimensional view of what it is. Just final thing to say, quite a few years ago, I did also a different consultancy for Parramatta City Council with colleagues on the nighttime economy of Parramatta, and that, you know, that revealed two things. One is the importance of sport within the nighttime economy, but we discovered that if you track the flows through Parramatta, lots of the fans just went to the stadium and then they went back to the transport interchange and left. So it actually didn't culturally enrich Parramatta that much. So you know, we thought that was important to try and connect a sports event to wider cultural provisions within the city, and but also, of course, as other people have found out, nighttime economy, which people have talked about, your pleasure could be my nightmare if you live in a precinct where a lot is going on, and some of that is connected with post-sports activities. So obviously, a hugely complex area, but I completely agree that that sport should not be pigeonholed as something for kind of brainless jocks, which my more intellectual colleagues tell me it is.
Any other questions? Do you want to hear from the rest of the
If you don't
panel?
mind,
Yeah,
I
please
think
do.
you said the panel. I'm actually seeing that it's moving from competitive sport to more individual sport. So you mentioned the word spiritual. I'm seeing a lot of the younger generation, women in particular, doing yoga and Pilates as their way. I'm also seeing, you know, with the 14 or 17-story schools, that they're taking away the sports ground. So sports changed yet again. We've seen mountain biking uptick, pickleball as an uptick, but a lot of the, what I'd say, traditional competitive sports, such as gymnastics, etc. We used to teach that when we were in schools. We don't do that anymore. So, you know, yet again, risk aversions come into it. Yeah, just more for themselves, and then the social that goes with, like they go for the coffee or whatever else. So it is a dynamic that has changed. There is no doubt about it. Yeah. Anyone else want to make leisure, sport?
I could make a comment about that. Not about sport in particular, but something that I'm noticing, which seems to be happening around the world, is a growing interest in what they call social prescribing. So the World Health Organization defines health as not just being the absence of disease, but, you know, encompassing holistic well-being. And so there are growing waves of interest around the world, in the UK, the US, and more recently in Australia, about having health professionals prescribing, you know, community activities, arts-based activities, sports, all of those sorts of things as part of the regular treatment plans. So I think there's a growing recognition that all of these things are important for well-being, and that's definitely a pendulum swing that I think is good.
Okay, so on that note, I might ask a question if that's okay. And I just wonder, in an increasingly medicalised society, are we in danger of leisure being reduced to simply a dose-response calibration, which ends up being underwritten or an underwriting process for the economy as opposed to something for a personal benefit?
Good question. I think in this area there is, I think we've touched on it, a kind of ambivalence or a contradiction or something between the idea of, say, freedom and absence of constraint and openness and liberation kind of thing, that side of what we call leisure, and then the prescriptions for leisure, forms of leisure that are good for you, or someone else determines to be good for you. And I think that, you know, that is a very, very hard balance to maintain. I mean, clearly there are forms of leisure which are dangerous and antisocial, and which we don't particularly want to encourage. But on the other hand, we don't want, and this is the point I think about risk, to de-risk the sphere of culture and pleasure so much that it becomes kind of anodyne, a bit like the kids' playgrounds, like so boring, no self-respecting kid would get involved. So, I mean, I suppose the bit of culture that I've always, rather, played across is the one that pushes against prevailing social norms in a productive way, whilst also trying to deal with forms of activity that are violent, sexist, racist, whatever ism that you want to use. And I actually think that dynamic is something which we should be aware of and indeed should seek to maintain.
Anyone else want to speak?
Go ahead.
I think if it becomes a prescription, Tony, as you mentioned, whenever you take away the innate control, like the intrinsic factors, that's when you're going to lose the urge to be involved in leisure. So it must come from within, not from without.
Okay. We're going to draw a line under it now because we do have some afternoon tea outside. I wonder whether we might join hands for our panel. It's indeed a pleasure to be in such an esteemed group. We thank Arianne.
No, I just want to talk for 2 minutes before we go for afternoon tea. So you know who I am already. I just wanted to tell you about an initiative that we are putting together at Western at the moment. So that kind of inspired us to bring this panel together. So we are currently applying to become a World Leisure Centre of Excellence. And this is part of the World Leisure Organization, which I'm sure most of you haven't heard about. It's a very academic sort of and specific organization looking at leisure and leisure studies internationally. So this is a bit of a map of where they are and what they do. And they have a strand of advocacy, research, education, and knowledge transfer. And the World Leisure Centres of Excellence are part of their education strand. And they have World Leisure Centres of Excellence in 6 different countries, I think, at the moment. And one in Dunedin, one in the Netherlands, one in Brazil, a couple in Canada, one in China. I'm missing something. Breda University, the Netherlands as well. So anyway, so we are on that mission. And what we're trying to do, so the researchers here at Western who focus on leisure studies and as you could see today, very broadly conceived, they are very widely dispersed. And although important synergies have already been identified and are being developed, their extensive capabilities and spread across the university will allow the creation of the Centre of Excellence will allow it will provide a point of convergence for them to come together. So captured as a collective, a team of leisure scholars will make a major contribution not only to the university's teaching and learning activities and research impact, but also to the Western Sydney community, hopefully wider Australia and global academic community in this space. So going back to the question about how do we conceive leisure? How do we define leisure? I think an important point to remember is that leisure is a human right. And so it's something that we really need to be, I guess, advocating for as an institution and as academics who want to make a positive impact on their community. So the term leisure studies for us that comes associated with the World Leisure Centre of Excellence will provide a platform to bring together the work of scholars from different disciplinary fields across the university who work in areas as diverse as you saw here today: health, business, social sciences, education, psychology, medicine, youth studies and cultural studies, but who are all interested in human behavior through leisure engagement in sport, arts, tourism, recreation, physical activity, and more. So this group of scholars, some of them here today, some of you in the audience as well, represents the broader and varied nature of leisure-related research across Western, and encompasses 5 schools and 2 institutes across the university. So our proposal for a Centre of Excellence will showcase this breadth and impact of the high quality community engaged scholarship being conducted in leisure at Western. So we truly believe that this will strengthen our existing relationships with partners, with industry partners, and extend the capacity of our university to in a coordinated and a strategic way to position Western as a global leader in leisure studies. So the event today is the first step in that direction. I really would like to thank you all for attending today. I'm sure you all really enjoyed the presentations, were fantastic. And thanks again to the presenters. Thank Gabrielle for the support through the Team Champion platform, I guess. And now let's go and have a chat over some afternoon tea. Thank you. That's good.